Welcome to Waterside Chat. Tom Sadler talks with guests who depend on healthy oceans and fisheries for their recreation and livelihoods. And now, let's get started.
Well, good afternoon and welcome to today's Waterside Chat. I am Tom Sadler, the host, and I am the Deputy Director of the Marine Fish Conservation Network. Today, I'm delighted to welcome a Marine Fish Conservation Network alumna, Andrianna Natsoulas. Andrianna is the campaign director for Don't Cage Our Oceans, and they're a coalition group working on policy and advocacy related to open ocean aquaculture. They also promote the sustainable seafood approaches to feeding America. Andrianna worked on agriculture and fisheries issues for more than 2 decades. She's been a consultant and worked with organizations like Food and Water Watch, North American Marine Alliance, and the Northeast, and the Northeast Organic Farming Association of New York. Andrianna is also the author of Food Voices, Stories from the People Who Feed Us. And it's a collection of personal stories from farmers and fishermen across 5 countries who are part of the food sovereignty movement. This afternoon, we'll be talking about aquaculture, the need for fish farming practices that are embedded in social, economic, and environmental values. Andrianna, it's a delight to have you here.
Well, thank you so much, Tom. It's exciting to be back with the network for this conversation.
Terrific. Well, let's jump into it. As you and I talked about earlier, aquaculture has been getting increased attention, I think, both positive and negative, in the last few years. So can you help us understand the various types of aquaculture and what some of those concerns are around the open ocean aquaculture?
Yeah, definitely. So there are many different kinds of aquaculture, and you may hear different words for them. It may be aquaculture, fish farming, mariculture, but essentially it is a controlled growing of a marine organism for human use. So it could be consumption or for other uses. And so there's been a lot of flurry in the news lately about the salmon farms, both off of the coast of Washington State and off of Maine. And so those salmon farms are established in coastal waters and state waters. And so those are overseen by the State Department of the Environment or the State Department of Fish and Wildlife, whatever it is, depending on that state and their regulations. So we have these salmon farms that are being grown in these open nets. We have years of research of the negative impacts that these salmon farms have had on other fish populations, on the marine environment, on coastal communities. And so now we've seen in Washington State, they've been banned. Cook Aquaculture has had to remove their nets from the cages. In Maine, there is quite a bit of controversy. There were attempts to pass legislation this past session in Maine to ban them. It didn't pass, but there are a lot of concerns with salmon aquaculture because of very similar concerns that we see in offshore fish farming, which I will get to in a little bit.
Okay.
Then we have offshore fish farming, which again, will talk about in a minute. But before we go there are other kinds of aquaculture that we do support. And what does that look like? We don't always just say no, we also do say yes. So some of those systems that we really do support and we work to uplift at Don't Cage Our Oceans is those systems that are really embedded in communities, those systems that benefit local communities, local economies, and provide nutritious fish to those local communities. And so what we're talking about, and there's always going to be excess and there is going to be trade. And so we're not, we are really supporting thriving local economies where people are able to grow oysters and mussels and seaweed in ways that have the environment at its center, that are embedded in a framework of values that support local economies, local communities, local food nutrition, that support the environment. And so those types of aquaculture systems, I think, could bring our coastal communities even more thriving opportunities. And some of these fish farms, I'm focusing on the coast, but there are also certain types of fish farms that are recirculating farms that do grow in urban areas in the middle of the country. And if they're true recirculating farms, these are farms that do not have any opportunity for escapement, no opportunity for water contamination, and the water is specifically recirculated. A lot of these farms also grow hydroponic plants, and so it's a mixed system where you have both animal protein in the form of fish, and then you also have plant protein in the form of let's say Swiss chard and other kinds of greens and tomatoes even, where it's a recirculating system that, again, is focused on doing it in a way that has the environment at its core and local nutrition, local communities, and local economies at its core. Unfortunately, there are some recirculating systems that have been taken over by some of the larger industrial aquaculture farms and aquaculture companies. Even those now, though, are having some challenges. There was one plan to develop a huge recirculating farm in Pioneer, Ohio. There's been a lot of concerns around that in terms of worker safety issues and environmental concerns. And so that is no longer moving forward at this moment. They've stopped construction of that plant. So when we talk about recirculating farms, we're really talking about recirculating farms that are embedded in values. So that's a really quick overview of those salmon farms that we see in the coastal areas. Some of the great coastal aquaculture, like the bivalves, the mussels, the oysters, the seaweed, which also does occur farther out. And then we have offshore fish farming. And offshore fish farming is the type of aquaculture that Don't Cage Our Oceans focuses on fighting. So just to back up a second, we are Don't Cage Our Ocean. Our mission is to stop the development of offshore fin fish farming in the United States through federal law, policies, and coalition building.
I wanted to come back to a couple of things that you were talking about before we got into what Don't Cage Our Oceans does. The concern that you and I talked about a while back was that aquaculture, to a certain degree, is a new area, right? And that the concern is that if we're not careful, we could be making mistakes that we're seeing in the terrestrial side, where and I don't want this to sound overly concerning, but where it's become industrialized, and there's probably a place for that, but we're learning more and more that the focusing on local economies, local growers, local producers, and the historic communities that have provided food are sometimes disadvantaged, and that if we don't do this right, that we create that same dislocation, if you will, on in the oceans. Is that a reasonable concern at this point?
Yeah, I mean, if we're looking at, and I'm sorry, my camera's just not.
No worries.
Not working. So, I mean, if we look at these systems of the offshore fish farming, so we're talking about offshore. You all know what offshore is, right? It's 3 typically 3 miles out to 200 miles out, unless you're in the Gulf of Mexico, then it's 9 miles out. And so when we're looking at these offshore fish farms, we're drawing a lot of understanding from what has happened in the salmon farms. We're drawing a lot of understanding from other similar facilities in deep waters off of Hawaii. So just to be able to outline the concerns that we have with these offshore fish farms, which is essentially a floating CAFO, right? It's a floating confined animal feeding operation. And
Right.
so and even the Environmental Protection Agency's permit requirement is a CAFO permit. So
Interesting.
when people are looking to get all the various permits required to establish one of these offshore fish farms, they are submitting a CAFO permit to the Environmental Protection Agency. So we've already learned so much about the concerns about land-based CAFOs. And so now we're looking at these marine-based CAFOs. And what we're seeing is issues around fish feed. So they're taking forage fish. These are like menhaden that all these small, the rest of the marine ecosystem depends on. So they're taking forage feed to be able to feed these farmed fish. And they're not to a 1-to-1 pound ratio. So we're not going to get 1 pound of farm fish to the 1 pound of forage fish that we're taking out of the ocean. Another concern is all of the antibiotics that they're putting into the feed to be able to combat diseases. And those antibiotics end up being released into the environment through waste of the fish. And we have seen in these deep water fish farms off of Hawaii, which is very similar to what we would see in federal waters if this were to go forward, which it hasn't yet because of various regulations and rules and lack of policy and lack of regulation and rules in the U.S. Congress and the U.S. government. So what we've seen in these deep water fish farms off the coast of Hawaii is that the nitrogen waste from the fish includes some of these antibiotics and has resulted in coral reef damage. So we've already seen this in the same kind of facilities in the deep waters off of Hawaii. Another concern that we have is the marine mammal interactions. And again, just looking at Hawaii, because these farms in Hawaii are the same structures that are being proposed for our federal waters. And there have been marine mammal interactions where endangered monk seals have been caught up in the nets and have drowned. We have seen a paper came out recently that was studying over years behavioral changes in bottlenose dolphins. And these bottlenose dolphins are going to these cages because they see them as, oh, this is a buffet. I have any fish that I want to pull it out of the cage, and now I have my very own buffet. And what this research identified is that these bottlenose dolphins actually have been experiencing behavioral changes as a result of these aggregated feeding systems where they're able to go and have a buffet. So they're having increased aggression, which means they are very physically and very aggressively pushing the spinner dolphins away from these cages, changing also the behavior of the bottlenose dolphins and having them be more solitary animals. So we've seen in these cages, and this is scientific peer-reviewed research.
Right.
Mm-hmm. We've seen in these systems off of Hawaii very marked behavioral changes in the marine mammals. And as I already said, the monk seals have drowned. There's at least 2 documented deaths of the monk seal associated with these farms. And you see something similar with the salmon farms. We do pull from lessons learned in the salmon farming industry, and there are often seal and whale interactions with the salmon farms. And that same kind of interaction is expected to be in these offshore farms, which we, as I've already mentioned, have actually seen in the Hawaiian farms. The other concern that we do have is the carbon footprint of raising these animals more than 3 miles out, and the barges that are necessary to be able to service them. Where are they processed? How are they processed? bring that back and forth. Again, going back to the issue of feed. So I mentioned the forage fish that are included in the feed that is necessary to raise these carnivorous fish. So we're talking about finfish.
Right.
And so this feed is now being mixed with corn and soy. And that corn and soy is genetically modified corn and soy. And so going back to that concern of the carbon footprint, where is that coming from? Where is that corn and soy coming from? Where is it being processed? And how is it getting out to these fish? When this is a completely unnecessary industry. And for over 20 years, there have been efforts to move bills in the US Congress to allow for this. And for 20 years, they failed because it seems to us, and from the research that we've conducted, that really these are not environmentally sustainable and they're not even economically viable. One thing that we have done at Don't Cage Our Oceans, and sorry if I'm getting ahead of myself, so maybe I'll just take
No, go where you want to go. We don't have
a so we've researched funding of these offshore fish farms, looking at only finfish, and looking at taxpayer money that's going for research and development through NOAA. So that may be the Sea Grant, the Stolzenton Kennedy, the small business, and what grants. And what we have seen between 2017 and 2022 is over $41 million have been going towards research and development of these offshore fish farms. And they don't even exist yet. And so how are these going to be able to be economically viable on their own, be able to have legs on their own? One of the farms, one of the companies that has been a great proponent of offshore fish farms is Oceanera. And Oceanera is the one who first developed the farms in the deep waters off of Hawaii. Oceanera has claimed bankruptcy 3 times. So how economically viable are these? And then on top of that, we have all of these environmental concerns that I've already outlined.
Wow. The focus of Don't Cage Our Oceans isn't just stopping open ocean aquaculture. You've got other programs. Talk a little bit about those, will you?
Yeah, I mean, our other programs are to support working waterfronts. So we've been working with some members on Congress in developing mechanisms to support working waterfronts. And so what we mean is having a seaside infrastructure would support processing, would support distribution, would support access. When we talk about some of these oyster farms and mussel farms, there's not, one of the biggest problems is access to the sea. And this is something that fishermen do find around the coast as well, not just oyster and mussel farmers, is that access, because it's become prime real estate. Right. And so one thing that we have been looking at in terms of working waterfronts is how can we really support working waterfronts and land access? And so that's something that we would like to get more engaged in. And I just want to share one story that we actually were not involved with, but I think it is a model that could be replicated around the coasts. In Barnegat Light, New Jersey, there is an oyster farming collective. And one of the big concerns at this oyster farming collective, so this oyster farming collective is about 5 or 6 different companies, and they work together in marketing and policy and support, technical support. And so they didn't have access. And so Barnegat Light Municipality was able to purchase land and provide access. And so those are the type of solutions that Don't Cage Our Oceans is looking at. You know, how do we really make these waterfronts working? How do we make these waterfronts support the community-based fish farmers and the community-based wild-caught fisheries? And so that is one of our big focuses is what is the solution and how can we uplift and support that solution?
For sure.
But in the meantime, we are quite focused on fighting the offshore finfish farming that is potentially looming and could be just another lash against coastal communities and our marine ecosystem.
So you mentioned EPA, you've mentioned NOAA. There was recently legislation introduced to put some parts of aquaculture, and I'm not being articulate about this, so you can correct me. But to me, from what I quickly read through, was it was the more shore-based aquaculture within the USDA.
Okay, so there are two things that have happened in the last couple of weeks.
Okay.
It's very, very busy June, and I think Capitol Hill Ocean Week kind of excuse me,
Created an impetus.
started everything. Yeah. So at the end of Capitol Hill Ocean Week, something called the Aqua Act was reintroduced into the Senate. And the Aqua Act is a piece of legislation that we have seen over the last 20 years. It was also introduced in 2018 and ever since in every Congress. And it hasn't gone anywhere because there isn't the interest from the members and there is so much opposition from the constituents. So the Aqua Act was introduced in the Senate at the end of Capitol Hill Ocean Week by Senator Chats from Hawaii and Wicker from Mississippi. And so that bill has now a companion that was introduced, I think on the 14th or the 12th of June, the following week. And that was introduced in the House. And the sponsors were Kat Kamek from Florida, Representative Case from Hawaii, and then Ezell from Mississippi, the new Mississippi member of Congress who replaced Collado. And so now we do have both a House and a Senate version of the Aqua Act. And the Aqua Act, as I said, has been introduced essentially for the last 20 years, hasn't gone anywhere. And that piece of legislation would open federal waters for offshore fish farming. The other thing that happened is something called the Shells Act.
Yeah, that was it.
And the Shells Act, which is a bipartisan piece of legislation, and the Shells Act would establish a Office of Aquaculture within the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And so since the U.S. Department of Agriculture oversees farms, right, then it makes sense that the USDA would have input in aquaculture. But of course, as many, Marine Fish Conservation Network members and supporters know, that's not within the USDA. Federal waters is not within the U.S. Department of Agriculture's jurisdiction. Right. And so when we're talking about an Office of Aquaculture within the U.S. Department of Agriculture, which is in the Shells Act, we're looking at the coastal. We're looking at the coastal aquaculture that I was just talking about in terms of, bivalves and mussels and seaweed farming. It would also potentially include some of these coastal salmon farm proposals, and some of the, of course, on-land recirculating farms and other land-based fish farms. So that's interesting. We'll see where that goes. At the moment, Decatur Oceans does not have a position on it. We have been in conversation with the sponsors and the co-sponsors. So that, it's been a very busy week.
Well, let me jump back for a second. So, I'm not going to put you on the spot, and the network hasn't taken a position on either of these bills, and it's I think, to be clear about this, we have members of our policy council who are coalition members of yours, and so this is something that we hear about, but we're not directly working on. But I think both Rob and I and others on the staff feel that this is an area that's going to get continual increasing attention as we go forward because of a variety of factors: climate change, importing fish, exporting fish. It's all tied up in a lot of that. And then, of course, supporting our local communities. So, but what was interesting to me is that, as you mentioned, under the Shells Act, it's conceivable that those fish farms that were in the state of Washington's waters could have gotten swept into this. It's I'm looking sort of for your thoughts on, they're creating a tension here between commerce and NOAA and agriculture. Do you see that? And again, I'm not holding you to this. It's just you and me speculating to this crowd that's going to listen and watch. But do you see that as a good thing, a bad thing? How does that play out as you're thinking about the federal government's thumb on the aquaculture scale, I guess is the question.
It's NOAA and NIMS has done some excellent work in some of the fisheries rebuilding and some of the other focuses they have. But in terms of offshore fish farming, they've been great proponents of it. And so it's a challenge to think about working with NOAA and NIMS and coming to some sort of agreement around offshore fish farming. And then when we look at agriculture, U.S. Department of Agriculture has some excellent policies in place. They've also caused some great harm to the family farmers. Right. But in a way, I think that by bringing in agriculture, the USDA, there are some new opportunities for collaboration and communication.
So when you say new opportunities, are you talking about between the two federal agencies?
No, I'm talking.
So it's always funny when you have old hands who know the world of Washington, D.C. so well, and you throw out a question like that, the answer is no. Yeah, I get you.
No, I think it's an excellent opportunity for groups like ours,
right,
and our members to have conversations with the U.S. Department of Agriculture and be able to work with them and designing some programs that really benefit the people.
So what has intrigued me and kept me thinking about this more is that during the pandemic, there was a great push, great interest in getting food to people who were in underserved communities. And there was a lot of activity around trying to get the delivery programs at the USDA to actually use seafood. Mm-hmm. And it was a bit of a challenge because they weren't quite ready for knowing how to handle that. And I think it was frustrating to our members who wanted to see, those food nutrition programs to serve underserved communities or to get food to underserved communities, and especially indigenous communities, sort of having a challenge to do some education over at aquaculture. I mean, at agriculture. If we could get the right people in the room, do you think there's an opportunity for using both departments? Do you think it would be better to have it sit one place or the other? I think you made reference to the fact that NOAA and NIMS has done a very good job, reasonable job. You characterize it how you want, of recovering fish, and let's be straightforward about that. It's wild fish. They haven't recovered those species because they grew them. And I'm going to go on my, I'm not a fan of hatcheries rant here, where, it's this fish farms, open ocean fish farms smell like hatcheries to me. And a good friend of mine once said to me, if you have to use hatcheries, you've failed in taking care of your habitat and environment. So let me come back to my question, which is, do you think it makes sense to try to get the two programs talking to each other, or the two departments talking to each other, or does it make sense to stick them one place or the other?
I mean, I am all in for collaboration and coordination, right? I mean, I'm here at one coalition. I started my career at a different network, which you're sitting in right now. So I'm all into collaboration, coordination, and it would be great if there was opportunities for the various departments to be able to coordinate and collaborate with true public input and public comment and a public process. I think that's the only way that it would be successful. But there has been an interagency aquaculture working group for the past 20 years. So yeah, years ago when I was in DC, I would go to those meetings once in a while. I don't know what they talked about. I mean, I was sitting there and I didn't know what
All right, so we go back to my original point.
Yeah.
But I mean, so to me, this gives us an opportunity, and as I said, the network hasn't taken a position, and we're familiar with the Aqua Act, and I'll show my cards a little bit more, in that I have I'm always wary of federal legislation trying to solve problems that they don't have a clear understanding of what the real problem is. But that said, and then you've got the Shells Act. Yeah. Is there a opportunity to, oh golly, I hate even saying these words, so don't hold them against me in the future, but legislative a solution here of getting the two? I mean, there's a reasonable thinking that could go on of saying, well, agriculture understands farming, and NOAA NIMS understands fisheries management, and maybe there's a way to, God, I hate to say this, but force them to work together under some agreement, legislative or regulatory, that says, we have the benefit of the oceans creating nutritious, sustainable seafood. Let's make sure we do the sustainable, wild, natural, if you will, wild fish first, before we start talking about, or before we start putting a tremendous amount of money into, I'm going to say artificial and it's man-made ways of raising food. And
yeah, I mean, I don't know, honestly. I mean, my answer is I really don't know. The thing is that, we'd have to look at jurisdictional differences, right? Because ag doesn't have jurisdiction over federal waters. But in that case, neither does NOAA, also does not have jurisdiction over aquaculture and federal. Right. They are not mandated under Magnuson. They were mandated under Magnuson-Stevens Fishery Conservation Act. They were mandated only to oversee wild fisheries,
right?
Not aquaculture. And there was actually a court case which found that NIMS does not have jurisdiction over offshore fish farms, and that went to court. It was the Gulf Fishermen's Association against NIMS. Gulf Fishermen won. It was appealed, won again. And in the meantime, then President Trump, this was in May of 2020, Trump signed an executive order, 13921, that essentially handed the reins over to the agencies. So when you're talking about cross-agency coordination and collaboration, and I know that you're specifically talking about ag, USDA, and NOAA NIMS, but in this executive order 13921, Trump assigned NOAA as being the lead agency.
Right.
And then to coordinate with the Environmental Protection Agency and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineer and any other agency that has any, finger in the pot, so to say. And we've been fighting that executive order. We've
Right.
been asking the Biden administration to revoke it. And even looking at that executive order, which was signed in reaction to that court case, which was still upheld. So that executive order was signed in May of 2020. The appeal to that lawsuit was that summer following June, July, and it was upheld. So the court still upheld that NOAA does not have jurisdiction over offshore fish farming, even though the executive order said, NOAA, you are the lead, start a permitting process. And then there'll be these other agencies that will need to be brought in here and there. Even with that executive order, NOAA is going forward and identifying these aquaculture opportunity areas. And they so far have done so in the Gulf of Mexico and Southern California. So these are offshore sites.
Right.
Where fish farms could be developed. But even then, they're not really coordinating with the EPA or the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. So getting back to your question of, well, can they coordinate? And maybe it's a really great match because agriculture knows farming and, NIMS knows open waters. I don't know. I mean, I really don't think that either of them at this point are in the position to be able to develop a offshore fish farming system that is in fact sustainable and environmentally sustainable and economically viable, because we simply don't believe that it can happen because we haven't seen it be able to happen.
Right.
So I kind of feel like, the idea of having the USDA and NOAA or NIMS coordinating is kind of a moot point in terms of offshore fish farming, because whoever's overseeing it, it's not economically viable and environmentally sustainable. One thing that I didn't mention before is the worker safety issues. There have been diver deaths. There have been OSHA complaints. And so that just, further confirms that these offshore systems wouldn't work. Now, if you're asking, what about coordination between the U.S. Department of Agriculture and NOAA when it comes to the coastal systems? That isn't NOAA's jurisdiction.
Right.
That falls into state waters. So, I don't really know what the real opportunities and solutions would be if the two agencies chose to work together. And I also do have to say that, in terms of farming, the USDA has done a lot of, as I mentioned earlier, damage to the family farmer. And when we're looking at the feed component of these fish farms, and we're looking at the corn and soy coming into it, the industry block that is currently supporting offshore fish farms is made up of some of the big agribusinesses like Cargill, Merck, and Cisco. So Cargill's looking at the fish feed. Merck is looking at the antibiotics and other sides that are necessary to prevent, funguses and algae, and then Cisco for the distribution. The other thing that's happened recently is some of the capital ventures are looking at investing in offshore fish farming. And now Goldman Sachs is investing in salmon farming in Europe. And at the same time that salmon farming in Europe is being more and more regulated. So it's just, it's a dirty industry. Honestly, it is simply a dirty industry. So getting the USDA and NOAA to, play together, I don't know what that's going to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I mean, there's clearly concerns that, it's an area that I again, maybe it's because I'm as old as I am and I've been doing this as long as I've been doing it. I worry that we're about to step into, or we will continue down a path that will lead us to a lot of the same mistakes that we're now dealing with on the land side, by just opening up and saying, well, let's go for, and the fact is that the permit is a CAFO permit, a confined animal feeding operation permit from the Environmental Protection Agency, seems a little scary to me in all candor. So I think this conversation, I hope, raises in people's minds the myriad problems surrounding open ocean offshore, open ocean aquaculture. I'm being cognizant of the time, it's 1:15, and but I do want to do one thing really quickly. You also have a good focus on working with local communities, focusing on social, economic values based in those local communities. Can you talk just a little? I want to go out on a little bit higher note than where I've taken this conversation. So talk a little bit about how you're raising awareness on that kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, we are. So one thing that I didn't say at the beginning of this is that we are a really diverse coalition. So we have national groups like Food and Water Watch and Slow Food USA and National Family Farm Coalition. And then we do have our regional groups like Healthy Gulf, Alpha, Alaska Longline Fishermen's Association, which I know is also a member of Marine Fish Conservation Network. And then
Healthy Gulf.
And Healthy Gulf is too, that's right. And then we have individual fishing organizations and businesses, and we have individual chefs. Like we have restaurants in Maine, California, and Louisiana and New Orleans. And so, we are national.
Right.
And so our focus is on federal legislation and policies and litigation. We also are currently a plaintiff in a lawsuit against the Army Corps of Engineers with a nationwide permit, which came out of the executive order. But the way that we uplift and support our partners, our members, is by, working with them with their local events, highlighting them on social media, being able to collaborate on events. So having like Little Fish Fest, where we're really lifting up and supporting the connections between the sustainable wild caught fishing and the chefs. So for example, in New Orleans, supporting an event in New Orleans with some of the Gulf shrimpers and our restaurant members. And so that's, the way that we're really uplifting what's we consider as the way to a solution for local economies, our marine environment, and changing the tide on climate change, climate chaos, is really by supporting the efforts of our regional and local members. They know what's going on in their communities. We don't. We're federal, we're national. So the way that we support them is by supporting their initiatives and their events and their activities and giving them a national platform to speak.
Well, I can't applaud you enough for doing that, because, a lot of small local organizations don't have a national platform. They don't have a big voice. They don't, it's great if it's a sustainable seafood night at the local seafood restaurant, but if nobody knows about it and if nobody's encouraged to do it, then it's hard to keep that momentum going. So I applaud you for doing that. It's the same kind of thing that, as the network has a similar way of doing things. Is if we're not doing it, we're going to share the stories of people who are doing it. And just like this, while we're not actively engaged in the aquaculture policy development conversation, we do feel it's an important conversation that our members and others should hear about. And to that end, if people want to learn more about Don't Cage Our Oceans, where can they go?
They can go to our website, which is don'tcageouroceans.org. And it's really easy to join us. And hopefully some of the network members and supporters would be interested in joining. all we ask is for people to agree with our mission, vision, and values. And I'm putting a link in the chat here. Hopefully that can be transmitted as well once you move this.
We'll stick it in the show notes for sure.
Yeah, and so that gives everybody some information about what it means to join, how to join. There's a form we ask people to fill out. And by joining, you are part of a nationwide effort to stop offshore fish farms while uplifting and supporting the stuff that's going on right at the local and regional levels.
And I think Andrianna, that is just so important these days, is to raise awareness of the local community efforts. I personally think that's terrific. From the network's point of view, it's something we want to do. Are you on the regular social media channels?
We have, yep. And if you just go to our website, you can find all of our media. We are on Facebook and Instagram. Those are the two that we're most active on. There is our website.
Awesome.
We are taking a break from Twitter at the moment while we're
well, let me throw a plug in for Post and Substack. So do you guys have a newsletter? Do you guys
don't have a newsletter?
Not yet. So, take a look at Substack. It's a great newsletter platform.
Yeah.
Andrianna, I really appreciate you taking the time to join us. I know this is a challenging subject in a challenging time, and I applaud you guys for putting your shoulders to the wheel on this one. We will continue to follow your efforts, and just want to thank you for taking the time today.
Well, thanks so much. And, I would love to hear from your members. If they have questions, they can reach out. They can reach out directly to me. They can reach out through our website.
Well, I'm going to wrap it up for today and say thank you again. Really appreciate it. It's always good to bring people who are not only informed but passionate about these issues, and I thank you for your hard work in the past and going forward. That's it for today. I hope as this goes on, we can get you on for another Waterside Chat. Mm-hmm. And our next one's in the works. We'll be doing one in July. And we may take a break in August, but we may not. So we shall see. Thank you again.
If you enjoyed this episode of Waterside Chat, share it with your friends and colleagues. You can check us out on YouTube or most podcast services. To stay up to date on Waterside Chats and the Marine Fish Conservation Network, sign up for emails at conservefish.org. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you at the next Waterside Chat.